Have you ever stayed late at work, the whole office empty, and whispered a prayer under your breath, hoping God would give you peace before that meeting tomorrow, hoping he would say something, anything, to calm the fear that was eating you alive? It's strange how a single line of text on a computer screen can change everything. One email, 6 words. Meeting tomorrow. We need to talk. That was all it said. But those 6 words felt heavier than all the deadlines I had missed, all the late nights I had poured into proving myself, all the anxious hours I had prayed for strength. That was me. Sitting at my desk in the dim glow of a computer monitor, heart pounding as though the email was a gavel striking down a verdict. My job was on the line. My future was on the line. And in that moment, I kept asking myself the question you might be asking too. Why is God silent? The office was nearly deserted, emptied of its usual chaos. Just hours earlier, there had been laughter in the hallways, phones ringing, keyboards clattering, co-workers tossing comments across cubicles without even looking up from their screens. But now it was all gone. Just me. The low hum of fluorescent lights buzzing like insects above my head and the endless blinking of the cursor on my monitor. A half-empty coffee cup sat by my side, the ring of dried liquid staining a stack of reports I hadn't finished. The air was stale, heavy, carrying the faint smell of burnt coffee from the break room. And in that silence, I whispered the only words I had left. God, please. I can't lose this job. Not now. The words barely left my lips before they felt like they had already evaporated, disappearing into the stillness without ever reaching heaven. No sudden peace washed over me. No gentle whisper reminded me that he was near. Just silence. Silence that felt thicker than the shadows gathering at the edges of the room. Silence that sounded louder than the hum of the lights or the ticking of the clock on the wall. Silence that mocked me every time the cursor blinked, as if to say, still nothing. That email wasn't just an email. It was a crack in the dam. Behind it was everything I had been hiding, everything I had been trying to patch together with a thin veneer of strength. The cracks had been there for weeks, maybe months, but that subject line split them wide open. I thought about the deadline I had missed just a week ago, how my boss's face had tightened with that expression that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't grace either. I thought about the tension with my coworker, how our small disagreements had snowballed into cold silence, into sidelong glances in meetings, into comments I knew were meant to sting. I thought about the bills stacked in a pile on my kitchen counter, unopened envelopes because I already knew what was inside and I didn't have the money to cover them all. Rent was coming due again, and I barely had enough. Losing this job wouldn't just be losing a paycheck, it would be losing my stability, my security, my last thin thread of dignity. My mind spiraled quickly. If I lose this job, I lose rent. If I lose rent, I lose stability. If I lose stability, what do I even have left? Each thought struck harder than the last, each one echoing louder because there was no divine voice to drown it out. And that's when the silence became unbearable. It wasn't just the silence of an office after hours, it was the silence of heaven itself. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a blanket, suffocating instead of comforting. The kind of silence that turns prayer into an echo chamber where your own words are the only ones you hear. I wanted God to answer, even just a whisper, even just a fragment of reassurance. But all I heard was the sterile hum of lights and the mocking blink of a cursor. Even the lights flickered once, a quick snap and buzz that startled me before steadying again. I almost laughed, the bitter kind of laugh that chokes in your throat when you're too close to tears. Even the lights, I thought, even the lifeless electricity had more to say than God did in that moment. I leaned back in my chair and began taking stock, almost without realizing it. It was like my soul was keeping an inventory of every way I felt abandoned. My coworkers? Gone, their laughter still faint in the halls while I sat drowning alone. My boss? Cold, curt, hiding behind emails and veiled phrases. No warmth, no humanity, just, we need to talk. My family? They never really understood. To them, it was just a job. If you lose it, you'll find another one, they'd say, as if jobs were apples hanging on trees and not the lifelines I clung to just to keep a roof over my head. Myself? I felt disgusted with myself, weak for panicking, ashamed for doubting God. I told myself, you should be stronger. You should have more faith. And finally, there was God, the hardest one to put on the list, because I wanted to believe He was here, that He saw me. But what do you do when your prayers vanish into the ceiling? What do you do when the silence feels like rejection? I whispered again, harsher this time. Lord, where are you? If you cared, wouldn't you answer by now? The silence pressed heavier. My mind flashed back to the beginning, to the day I first stepped into this job. I could still see it clearly, my first morning walking through the lobby doors, heart racing with nerves but full of gratitude. I had prayed for this job. I had thanked God for answering. I had believed this was His provision, His way of opening a door for me. I remember setting my bag down on the desk for the first time, smiling quietly to myself, saying under my breath, "Thank you, Lord. You did this back then. I felt seen. I felt cared for. I felt carried. And now, sitting in the same chair, staring at an email that felt like a guillotine, I felt abandoned, forgotten, betrayed. How could something that once felt like a blessing now feel like a curse? How could silence feel like proof that He was never really here at all? The thoughts came like waves crashing without pause, each one darker than the last. Maybe God isn't listening. Or maybe He doesn't care. Or maybe I've messed up too much, and this is punishment. The silence became a voice of its own, telling me I was too broken, too unworthy, too small for God to notice. Every unanswered prayer echoed like evidence in a trial against His goodness. My faith, once aflame, felt like a faint ember, smothered by fear and shame. And then, like a flicker of light through the cracks, a verse slipped into my mind. I hadn't thought of it in years, but there it was, clear as if someone had whispered it into the room. Do not fear, for I am with you. Isaiah 41:10. For a moment I wanted to cling to it. For a moment I thought maybe this was God breaking through, but anger rose instead, hot and bitter. If you're with me, why won't you speak? Why won't you calm this storm? The verse that should have been a lifeline felt like a mockery, salt poured into an open wound. I shook my head and whispered into the empty room, "Don't tell me you're here when I feel this alone." And the silence answered back with nothing at all. I stayed there long after the email stopped blinking, long after the office felt more like a tomb than a workplace. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, until my reflection in the dark glass looked like a stranger I didn't recognize. My body slumped forward, drained, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I muttered one last prayer, softer than the rest, almost broken. If you're real, prove it. Nothing. Just the same buzz of lights, the same mocking blink of the cursor. And that's when it hit me. This silence wasn't new. This wasn't the first time I had felt it. This wasn't just about work. It was deeper than deadlines and heavier than a job. It was older, familiar. This silence had been with me before, in places I had buried and never wanted to face again. That night, I realized that if I was ever going to understand why God felt so absent now, I would have to go back to the places where the silence first began, back to the wounds I had covered but never healed. Because this wasn't just about an email or a meeting. This was about the silence that had followed me for years. I went home that night moving like a ghost through my own life. Keys in the door, shoes kicked off, jacket thrown over a chair that already held yesterday's clothes. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of streetlights bleeding through blinds I hadn't opened in days. I didn't turn on the lights. What was the point? Light wouldn't change anything. It would just make the emptiness more visible. My body knew the routine without my mind having to engage. Brush teeth, stare at nothing in the mirror, avoid eye contact with myself, check phone, scroll. 3 in the morning came and went, and I was still awake, thumb moving mechanically across the screen, not really seeing anything, just needing the motion, the distraction, the blue light burning my retinas because at least it was something to feel. I made myself a sandwich at some point, turkey, cheese, mustard. but I couldn't taste it. Each bite was just texture, just the mechanical act of chewing and swallowing. Food had become fuel, nothing more. Sleep had become a chore. Life had become autopilot. This was survival, but barely. Emotional anesthesia. I had numbed myself so thoroughly that even pain felt distant, like watching someone else's life through frosted glass. And maybe that's what scared me most. Not the silence of God, but my own silence. The way I had stopped fighting, stopped feeling, stopped hoping. I was going through the motions of being alive without actually living, breathing without being present, existing without purpose. But trauma has a way of refusing to stay buried. It rises like groundwater after rain, seeping through the cracks you thought you had sealed. And that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan, making its lazy circles, the memories began to surface. Not all at once. Trauma rarely announces itself that boldly. It came in fragments, in whispers, in the smell of my childhood bedroom, in the sound of a door slamming somewhere in my mind. I was 7 years old again, kneeling beside my bed with hands clasped so tight my knuckles turned white. My parents were fighting in the next room, their voices rising and falling like a terrible symphony. I could hear my mother crying, my father's voice sharp with frustration. The walls were thin, every word traveled, every accusation, every threat. And there I was, a child who still believed prayer was magic, whispering desperately, "God, please make them stop. Please make them love each other again. Please don't let our family break." I stayed on my knees until they hurt, until the carpet left marks on my skin. I prayed until I ran out of words, and then I just knelt there in the silence, waiting for God to do something, anything. The fighting didn't stop. Not that night, not the next. 6 months later, my father moved out. The divorce papers came like a verdict against every prayer I had whispered. I remember thinking, even at 7, that maybe I hadn't prayed hard enough. Maybe I hadn't been good enough. Maybe God was punishing me for something I didn't even know I had done. Or maybe, and this was the thought that haunted me most, maybe he just wasn't listening at all. The memory dissolved, but another took its place. 14 years old, high school cafeteria, sitting alone at a table meant for 6, pretending to read a book so no one would notice I had no one to sit with. The loneliness was so thick I could taste it, metallic and bitter at the back of my throat. Every night for months I had prayed the same prayer. God, please send me a friend. Just one. Someone who sees me, someone who gets me. I watched other kids laugh in groups, share inside jokes, make plans for the weekend. I watched them belong to each other while I belonged to no one. The silence that answered those prayers was different from the silence of my childhood. This wasn't the sharp silence of crisis. It was the dull, chronic silence of being unseen. Day after day, lunch after lunch, prayer after prayer. Nothing changed. I learned to eat quickly, to find corners of the library where no one would bother me, to wear invisibility like armor. By sophomore year, I had stopped praying for friends. I had accepted that some people were meant to be alone. Maybe I was one of them. Maybe God had decided that for me before I was even born. Then came the heartbreak at 22. First, real love, or what I thought was love. We had talked about marriage, about the future, about the names we'd give our children. When it ended, suddenly, brutally, with words that cut deeper than I knew words could cut, I found myself on my knees again. Different apartment, different carpet, same desperate posture. God, please, bring them back. Fix this. Don't let it end like this. I prayed for reconciliation, for a second chance, for the phone to ring with their voice on the other end, saying it was all a mistake. The phone never rang. The relationship never healed. They moved on within months while I spent a year trying to understand what I had done wrong. The silence that time felt like confirmation of my worst fears. I wasn't worth fighting for. I wasn't worth coming back to. Even God wouldn't advocate for me. These memories weren't random. I could see that now, lying in my bed at 3:30 in the morning, the ceiling fan still making its pointless rotations. They were a timeline, a genealogy of silence. And it wasn't just my silence. It went deeper. My family had our own culture of not talking about pain. We were experts at sweeping hurt under rugs, at changing the subject when conversations got too real, at smiling through dinner while everyone nursed their private wounds. My mother never talked about her father leaving when she was 12. My father never mentioned the business that failed and left him broken at 35. My grandmother took her sorrows to the grave without ever naming them aloud. We inherited silence like a family heirloom, passed down through generations, each of us adding our own pain to the collection without ever opening the vault to see what was really there. I thought about Sunday dinners where we all sat around the table, talking about weather and work and anything except what was really happening in our hearts. I thought about the phrase we all learned to say when people asked how we were. Fine. Everything's fine, even when everything was falling apart, especially when everything was falling apart. We had been trained in the art of pleasant deception, of hiding our wounds so well that sometimes we forgot they were there. Until moments like this, when the silence became too loud to ignore. But then something strange started happening. As I lay there drowning in memories of unanswered prayers, small moments began surfacing too. Moments I had dismissed, moments I had explained away. Divine interruptions disguised as coincidences. Like the time in college when I was walking to class, feeling invisible as always, and the campus radio station, playing from speakers I usually never noticed, suddenly played a worship song. Not just any worship song, but the exact one I had been humming the night before in my dorm room. The lyrics cut through the morning air. You're not alone. I am with you. I had stopped walking for a moment, frozen on the sidewalk, wondering if God was trying to tell me something. But then I shook my head and kept walking. Coincidence. Just coincidence. Or the stranger at the grocery store 2 weeks after the breakup when I was buying ice cream and wine, the official groceries of heartbreak. An elderly woman in line behind me touched my shoulder gently and said, "Whatever you're going through, dear, it's going to be okay. God sees you." She smiled and turned back to her groceries before I could respond. I stood there holding my Ben & Jerry's, tears threatening to spill in the middle of aisle 7. But I convinced myself she was just a sweet old lady making conversation. Nothing more. Or the Bible that fell off my shelf one night, I'm not making this up, and opened to Psalm 34:18. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The apartment was still. No wind, no earthquake. No reason for a book to fall. But books fall sometimes, I told myself. Spines get weak. Gravity does its work. It didn't mean anything. Except now, lying in the dark with years of silence mapped out before me, I wondered if I had been wrong. What if those moments weren't coincidences? What if they were God trying to break through my walls, trying to speak in ways I wasn't expecting? What if I had been so focused on the silence that I missed the whispers? Number. I pushed the thought away. That was just my desperation talking, trying to find meaning where there was none, seeing patterns in chaos because the human brain couldn't accept randomness. I was doing what everyone does when they're drowning, grabbing at anything that looks like it might float. Those moments meant nothing. They were just life happening, just random intersections of time and space that my lonely heart wanted to paint with divine significance. But even as I tried to dismiss them, more memories surfaced. The friend who called out of nowhere the night I was considering dropping out of college just to check in. The job opportunity that appeared the day after I had given up looking. The parking spot that opened up directly in front of the hospital the day I was rushing to see my grandmother before she passed. Small things. Tiny things. Things that anyone could explain away. Yet they kept coming. These memories of maybe miracles, these possible fingerprints of a God who might have been more present than I realized. Each one felt like a gentle knock on a door I had locked from the inside. Each one whispered the same question. What if I was never as alone as I thought? The resistance rose in me like bile. I didn't want to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was what had gotten me hurt in the first place. Hope was what made the silence unbearable. Better to accept abandonment than to keep believing in a God who wouldn't speak clearly, who wouldn't show up obviously, who wouldn't answer prayers the way I demanded them to be answered. But something in me, something deeper than my cynicism, older than my hurt, refused to let go completely. It was barely a whisper, barely a thought, but it was there. A crack in my armor, a tiny fissure in the wall I had built around my heart, and through that crack I heard myself whisper into the darkness of my room, "God, if you're really there, don't just stay silent. I'm not asking for thunder or angels or handwriting on the wall. I'm just asking for something, anything. Just let me know you see me." The ceiling fan kept turning. The darkness remained. The silence held. But somehow the prayer felt different this time, not like words thrown into a void, but like a seed planted in dark soil, like the beginning of something I couldn't yet see. Like the first authentic thing I had said to God in years, not a demand, not an accusation, just honest desperation wrapped in the thinnest thread of hope. I closed my eyes, not expecting an answer, but no longer quite convinced there wouldn't be one. Somewhere between memory and exhaustion, between doubt and the faintest flicker of faith, I finally fell asleep. And in my dreams, I heard something that might have been the wind, or might have been imagination, or might have been something else entirely. A whisper so quiet I couldn't make out the words, but somehow I knew it was saying my name. The archaeology of wounds was just beginning. I had excavated the first layers, found the broken pottery of old prayers, the fossilized remains of abandoned hope. But archaeology isn't just about uncovering the past. It's about understanding it, reframing it, finding meaning in the ruins. Tomorrow would come with its meeting, its consequences, its fresh wounds or unexpected mercy. But tonight, in the darkness of my room, surrounded by memories of silence and whispers of possibility, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not obviously, just a subtle repositioning of the heart, like tectonic plates moving imperceptibly beneath the surface, preparing for an earthquake that would change the landscape entirely. The silence was still there. But for the first time in years, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, it wasn't empty. Maybe it was pregnant with something I couldn't yet understand. Maybe God's silence wasn't absence, but presence in a form I hadn't learned to recognize. Maybe the archaeology of wounds would reveal not just pain, but purpose. I didn't know it then, but I was about to find out. The confrontation was coming. The wrestling match with heaven that would leave me forever changed. But first, I had to survive tomorrow. First, I had to face that meeting. First, I had to see if God would show up in the midst of my unraveling, or if the silence would swallow me whole. The last thought before sleep finally claimed me was this: what if silence is God's way of teaching us to listen differently? What if the archaeology of wounds is really the archaeology of grace, buried so deep we have to dig through pain to find it? I would soon learn that some questions can only be answered by living through them. Some silences can only be broken by breaking first ourselves. And some encounters with God only come after we've exhausted every other option, when we're finally desperate enough to wrestle with angels in the dark. But that's a story for another key point. For now, there was just me, the darkness, the silence, and the faintest whisper of something that might have been hope, or might have been God, or might have been both, breathing quietly in the space between heartbeats, waiting for tomorrow to reveal what had been hidden in the silence all along. The meeting was in 4 hours. But first, I need to tell you what happened at 2 a.m., because that's when everything changed. That's when I finally stopped being polite with God. I couldn't stay in bed. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in, like the silence had become a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I threw on yesterday's jeans, grabbed a jacket that had seen better days, and walked out into the night. No destination, no plan, just movement. Because movement felt like the only thing keeping me from completely dissolving into the darkness. The streets were empty except for the occasional taxi sliding through puddles from earlier rain. Steam rose from subway grates like incense from some underground cathedral. The city that never sleeps was whispering in its dreams, and I was the only one awake to hear it. My footsteps echoed off building walls, creating a rhythm that matched my racing heart. Click, 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 click. Like a countdown to something I couldn't name. But here's what nobody tells you about wrestling with God. Sometimes you have to get angry first. Sometimes faith looks less like kneeling in reverence and more like standing in the middle of an empty street at 2 a.m. shouting at the sky. And that's exactly what I did. "Where are you?" The words ripped from my throat before I could stop them. A dog barked somewhere in response, but heaven remained silent. I'm done being polite. I'm done pretending this is okay. Where were you when I was 7 years old, begging you to save my family? Where are you now when I'm about to lose everything? A window opened somewhere above me. Someone yelled to keep it down. I didn't care. This wasn't about them. This was between me and the God who had supposedly counted every hair on my head, but couldn't be bothered to answer a single prayer. You want to know what I really think? I was pacing now, talking to the sky like a madman, but the words wouldn't stop coming. I think you're either not there, or you're there and you just don't care. Which is worse? Which is worse, God, to not exist or to exist and watch your children suffer in silence? The anger felt good. It felt real. It felt like the first honest thing I had done in years. No more carefully worded prayers. No more, "Your will be done," when what I really meant was, "Why won't you do something?" No more pretending that silence was somehow holy when it felt like abandonment. I walked for miles that night, and with each step, another accusation poured out. I compared God's silence to every betrayal I had ever experienced. To my father walking out, to friends who promised to stay but didn't, to lovers who swore forever but meant until something better comes along. "You're just like them," I whispered, my voice hoarse now from shouting. "You're just another promise that turned into a lie, another hope that turned into disappointment, another voice that went silent when I needed it most." But then something strange happened. And pay attention here, because this is the part that changed everything. This is the moment when wrestling with God became something else entirely. I found myself standing in front of a 24-hour diner, one of those places with flickering neon and coffee that tastes like regret. The windows were fogged up from the warmth inside, but I could see my reflection in the glass door, and I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. This wasn't who I thought I'd become. The eyes were hollow, surrounded by dark circles that makeup couldn't hide anymore. The shoulders were slumped like they were carrying invisible weight. The mouth was set in a permanent line of disappointment. When did I become this person? When did faith turn into bitterness? When did hope transform into cynicism? I stood there, staring at this stranger who was somehow me, and that's when the real confrontation began. Not with God, but with myself. Because in that reflection, I saw the truth I had been avoiding. I wasn't just angry at God for being silent. I was angry at myself for still believing he might speak. "Look at you," I whispered to my reflection, 32 years old, talking to the sky like a crazy person, still waiting for Daddy to come home, still waiting for someone to choose you, still waiting for God to act like you matter. The reflection stared back, and for a moment, I swear this is true, I thought I saw something else in those hollow eyes. Not my pain, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like compassion. But not my compassion. Something from beyond me, looking through me, seeing me in a way I couldn't see myself. That's when the verse hit me. Not gently, not like a whisper, but like a slap across the face. Psalm 13. I hadn't thought about it in years, but suddenly it was there, word for word, like someone was reciting it directly into my mind. "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart?" Wait. Stop. Did you catch that? David, the man after God's own heart, the chosen king, the one who killed giants, he had felt this too. He had stood in his own dark night and shouted these same questions at the same silent sky. This wasn't blasphemy. This wasn't failure. This was faith in its rawest, most honest form. I pushed open the diner door. The bell chimed, too cheerful for 2:47 a.m. The waitress, a woman who looked like she'd seen too many late-night confessions, nodded toward an empty booth. I slid in, ordered coffee I didn't want, and pulled out my phone. I had to read the rest of that psalm. I had to know how David's confrontation ended. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. How? How did David make that leap from abandonment to trust, from accusation to praise? What happened in the space between verse 2 and verse 5? What did he discover in his own wrestling match with silence? The coffee arrived, black and bitter, steam rising like prayer. I wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling the heat burn through my palms, and that's when I heard it. Not audibly. I need you to understand this wasn't an audible voice. It was more like, have you ever been in a completely dark room and someone lights a match? You don't hear the light, but suddenly you know exactly where it is? It was like that, but with words. I was silent, but I was never absent. The mug slipped. Coffee spilled across the table, running in dark rivers toward the edge. The waitress rushed over with towels, muttering about tired customers and late nights, but I barely noticed. Because those words, those 7 words, had just reframed everything. What if, and stay with me here, because this is about to flip everything you thought you knew about God's silence. What if the silence wasn't abandonment? What if it was something else entirely? Think about it. When a parent teaches a child to walk, there comes a moment when they have to let go. They have to step back. They have to watch their baby stumble and fall and get back up. And in that moment, the parent is silent, not because they don't care, but because they care too much to keep carrying the child forever. The silence isn't absence. It's presence at a distance, watching, ready to catch if the fall becomes too dangerous, but allowing the struggle because the struggle creates strength. What if every unanswered prayer was not a rejection, but a redirection? What if every moment of silence was not emptiness, but fullness, so full of things I couldn't yet understand that words would have only confused me more? I sat in that booth, coffee pooling around my elbows, and began to see it differently. The divorce when I was 7, it was devastating, yes, but didn't it also teach me compassion for broken families? Didn't it make me the person who could sit with others in their pain without offering empty platitudes? The loneliness in high school, crushing at the time. But didn't it teach me to see the invisible people? Didn't it make me notice the ones eating alone, sitting alone, walking alone? The heartbreak at 22, I thought it would kill me. But didn't it save me from a relationship that, looking back, would have destroyed me in slower, subtler ways? No, I said out loud, causing the waitress to glance over. No, that's just rationalization. That's just trying to make meaning out of meaninglessness. But even as I said it, more pieces fell into place. The job I was about to lose. What if it needed to die for something better to be born? What if my white-knuckled grip on security was keeping me from the adventure God had planned? What if the meeting in 4 hours wasn't an ending, but a beginning disguised as loss? Here's where the story gets weird, and I mean weird in the way that makes you question whether you should share it or keep it to yourself forever. But you need to know this part, because this is where confrontation became surrender. I looked up from the coffee spill, and there was a man sitting in the booth across from me. I hadn't heard him come in. The bell hadn't chimed. He was just there, older, maybe 60, with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much, but somehow still believed in goodness. He was wearing a janitor's uniform, the name Michael stitched on the pocket. "Rough night?" he asked, gesturing at my coffee-soaked table. "Rough life," I answered, too tired to pretend otherwise. He smiled, not the pitying smile strangers usually give, but something deeper. Understanding. "You know what I learned?" he said, pulling a napkin from the dispenser and helping me clean up. "God's got 3 answers to prayer. Yes, not yet, and I've got something better. The problem is, the last 2 sound exactly like silence when you're desperate for the first one." I stared at him. "Did someone send you? Are you—" I stopped, feeling crazy for even thinking it. He laughed, a warm sound that filled the empty diner. "I'm just a guy who cleans buildings for a living. But I've had my own wrestling matches with God, had my own nights of shouting at the sky. Want to know what I discovered?" I nodded, unable to speak. The silence isn't God's absence, it's God's trust. He's trusting you to hold on when you can't see, trusting you to believe when you can't feel, trusting you to grow in ways that comfort would never allow. The silence is where faith stops being about what God can do for you and starts being about who you're becoming in the struggle. He stood up, dropped a $5 bill on my table for the coffee, and walked toward the door. Then he turned back. Your meeting's going to go differently than you think. Remember, sometimes God's silence is just him holding his breath, waiting for the perfect moment to speak. The bell chimed. He was gone. And I sat there, wondering if I had just had coffee with an angel, or a janitor with perfect timing, or just a projection of my desperate mind. But it didn't matter, because something had broken inside me, not broken like damaged, but broken like an eggshell breaks to let life out. I whispered into the empty diner, not a demand this time, but a surrender. Okay. Okay, God. If you're here, if you've always been here, I won't let go. Even if you never speak the way I want, even if the silence continues, I won't let go. But please, give me something. Not for my comfort, but for my faith. Let me know that this wrestling match means something, that you're on the other side of this silence, working things I can't see. Nothing dramatic happened. No voice from heaven, no sudden peace. Just me, sitting in a puddle of cold coffee at 3 a.m., feeling strangely held. Like invisible hands were supporting me even as I sat there alone. Like the silence itself had arms and they were wrapped around me, and they'd been there all along. I just hadn't known how to feel them until I stopped fighting. I walked home as the sun began to paint the edges of buildings gold. The city was waking up, delivery trucks rumbling, shop owners lifting gates, early joggers claiming the sidewalks. The meeting was in 2 hours now. My phone showed 3 missed calls from my boss. The terror should have been overwhelming, but instead, there was something else. Not peace exactly, but readiness. Like whatever was about to happen had already been decided in that diner, in that confrontation, in that surrender. I stood in my shower, hot water washing away the night, and found myself speaking to God again. But different this time. Not begging or demanding or accusing, just talking. Like he was actually there. Like he had always been there. Like the silence between us was not empty space, but sacred space, pregnant with possibilities I couldn't yet see. I still don't understand, I said to the shower tiles. I still don't know why you won't speak clearly. But maybe that's okay. Maybe faith isn't about understanding. Maybe it's about trust, and maybe trust isn't about feeling safe. Maybe it's about letting go even when letting go feels like falling. The meeting arrived faster than expected. I sat outside my boss's office, watching the clock tick toward 9 a.m. Other employees walked past, some giving sympathetic looks, others avoiding eye contact. They knew. Everyone knew. This was the walk to the gallows, and I was the condemned. But here's the thing about confronting God in the darkness. It changes how you face everything else in the light. I had wrestled with the creator of the universe at 2 a.m. I had survived his silence. I had surrendered to mysteries I couldn't solve. What was a meeting compared to that? What was job loss compared to finding God in the absence of God? My boss called me in. Her face was unreadable. The HR representative sat in the corner, folder in hand. This was it. The moment everything would fall apart, or maybe, just maybe, the moment everything would fall into place. Sit down, she said. We need to talk about your future here. I sat. I breathed. And in the silence before she spoke again, I could have sworn I heard something. Not words, but almost like laughter. Like God was enjoying a joke I didn't yet understand. Like the silence was about to break in ways I never expected. But that revelation, that reversal, that moment when everything I thought I knew got turned upside down, that's not for this key point. That's for what comes next. Oh, for now, just know this. The sacred confrontation had happened. I had wrestled with God and survived. I had been broken and somehow become more whole. I had faced the silence and found it wasn't empty after all. The real question now was, would I recognize God's voice when he finally spoke? Or had he been speaking all along, just in a language I hadn't learned to hear? You're about to find out. But first, I had to survive this meeting. First, I had to see what happens when you stop demanding that God speak on your terms and Start listening for him on his. The meeting is about to reveal something unexpected. But that's where key point 4 begins, where we discover the divine archaeology, where we look back with new eyes and see that God's fingerprints were everywhere we thought he was absent. We're promoting you. Those 3 words hung in the air like a glitch in the matrix. I stared at my boss, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the just kidding, waiting for reality to reassert itself. But she kept talking, and with each word, my understanding of everything, began to crumble and rebuild itself. Your struggles haven't gone unnoticed, she continued, shuffling papers that suddenly didn't look like termination documents. Neither has your persistence. The missed deadlines, the tensions with your team. We know you've been carrying more than your share. Peterson quit 2 months ago without telling anyone he'd been dumping his workload on you. We just found out last week. The HR representative leaned forward. We also found your after-hours logs. You've been here until midnight most nights, trying to cover for a team that was understaffed by 40%. You never complained, never threw anyone under the bus, just kept showing up. But here's what's going to blow your mind. What blew my mind. My boss pulled out a folder, and inside was every email I thought I had deleted, every prayer I had typed and erased, every desperate moment I thought no one had witnessed. The janitor found you crying in the supply closet 3 weeks ago, she said gently. He reported it to HR, not to get you in trouble, but because he was concerned. Said you were praying, said you were asking God for strength to keep going even though you felt abandoned. The janitor, Michael, the name on the uniform, the man from the diner at 3 a.m. But that was impossible because Michael's been with the company for 15 years, the HR rep added. He's seen a lot of people break under pressure. But he said you were different, said you were wrestling with something bigger than work, said we'd be fools to let you go. I walked out of that office 20 minutes later with a promotion, a raise, and a mind so blown I couldn't process what had just happened. But more than that, and pay attention, because this is where the archaeology really begins. I walked out with a question that would change how I saw everything. What else had I missed? You see, when archaeologists excavate a site, they don't just look for the obvious artifacts. They look for patterns in the soil. They look for traces of life in the negative spaces. They reconstruct entire civilizations from fragments others would call trash. And that's exactly what I needed to do with my own life. Excavate it with new eyes, looking for the fingerprints of God in places I had only seen absence. I went home and did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my old journals, every moleskin notebook I had filled with prayers, doubts, questions, and pain. They sat in a box in my closet like evidence of a faith I thought had died. But now, with shaking hands, I opened them, and what I found there changed everything. Let me show you what I mean. Here's an entry from 5 years ago, right after I got this job. God, thank you for this miracle. I was down to my last $100. Rent was due in 3 days. I'd given up hope. And then the call came. The job I didn't even remember applying for. The salary that was exactly, to the penny, what I needed to survive. How did you do that? I had forgotten. Completely forgotten. This job that I thought was killing me had once saved my life. But there was more. So much more. 3 years ago, an entry about a canceled date. I'm humiliated. Stood up again. Sitting in this restaurant alone while everyone stares. Why does this keep happening, God? Why am I never enough? But I remembered something else now. That night, walking home from that restaurant, I had taken a different route to avoid couples on the main street. That route took me past a homeless shelter where a woman was standing outside, crying. I stopped to ask if she was okay. Turns out she had just been kicked out for missing curfew after her shift ran late. I had $60 in my pocket, my dinner money from the canceled date. I gave it to her for a motel room. She had hugged me and said, God sent you. I had thought, no, God abandoned me tonight, but what if the date was canceled specifically so I would be there at that moment with that money for that woman? What if what I called rejection was actually redirection? The journals kept revealing more. Page after page of complaints followed by, if you looked closely, miracles I had missed. The flu that kept me home the day there was a massive pileup on my usual route to work. 12 cars, 3 fatalities, right where I would have been at 8:47 a.m. The relationship that ended 2 weeks before I discovered they had been lying about everything. Their job, their past, even their name. God hadn't answered my prayer to make it work. He had answered a prayer I didn't know to pray. Protect me from what I can't see. The friend who had betrayed me, spreading rumors that cost me my entire social circle. I had been devastated, but losing those friends had pushed me to join a different community, where I met the mentor who changed my career trajectory, introduced me to my now best friend, and taught me the skills that just got me promoted. But here's where it gets really wild. Remember that coworker I mentioned, the one where tensions had been growing? I'd been praying for reconciliation, for peace, for them to stop undermining me. God seemed silent on that too. But guess what I found out in that meeting? They were undermining me because they were drowning. They were battling addiction, going through a divorce and taking it out on everyone around them. My boss knew, HR knew, they were about to fire them. But then something strange happened. I had left a note on their desk 2 weeks ago, just a simple sticky note that said, "Hey, you seem stressed. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." I had forgotten about it. It seemed like nothing. But that coworker had broken down, gone to HR, admitted they needed help, and entered the company's rehabilitation program. They specifically mentioned my note as the moment they realized they weren't as invisible as they thought. "Your kindness in the midst of conflict," my boss had said, "showed us what kind of leader you could be." The archaeology kept going. Every prayer I thought went unanswered had actually been answered, just not in the way I expected. The prayer, "God, make me successful." The answer, failure that taught me resilience. The prayer, "God, make them love me." The answer, solitude that taught me to love myself. The prayer, "God, make this easy." The answer, difficulty that revealed strength I didn't know I had. I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by journals, and started crying. But not the bitter tears of abandonment anymore. These were tears of recognition, tears of gratitude, tears of absolute awe at the intricate ways God had been moving when I thought he was still. Then I found it. The entry that broke me completely. Written on the worst night of my life, 2 years ago, after my mother's diagnosis. God is silent. God is absent. God is either dead or deaf or cruel. Mom is dying. Prayers don't work. Faith is a lie. This is my last entry. I'm done believing. But there was something else on that page. Something I didn't write. In handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had added, "Your mother's nurse, Sarah, is praying for you both. The treatment that doesn't exist yet is being developed. The call will come on a Tuesday. Hold on." My hands shook. I had no memory of this. Who wrote this? When? How? I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, healthy, alive, 2 years into remission from a cancer that should have killed her. "Mom, do you remember your nurse, Sarah?" How could I forget? She was an angel. Literally told me about an experimental treatment that wasn't even public yet. Her husband worked in the lab developing it. She got me into the trial. The call came. "On a Tuesday," I finished. "How did you know that?" I couldn't answer. I was staring at handwriting that shouldn't exist, evidence of divine intervention that I had missed even when it was literally written in my own journal. But wait, it gets even more incredible. I pulled out my laptop and started mapping the timeline. Every single thing. The job I got just in time. The relationships that ended right before disaster. The opportunities that appeared from nowhere. The closed doors that protected me from paths that would have destroyed me. The silence that taught me to listen. The abandonment that taught me to seek. The wrestling that made me strong enough for the promotion I just received. It was all connected. A perfect web of cause and effect, of divine chess moves I couldn't see because I was a pawn convinced I was playing alone. Listen, I need you to understand something. This isn't prosperity gospel nonsense. This isn't everything happens for a reason, platitude. This is scarier and holier than that. This is the recognition that God had been writing a story with my life, and I had been so focused on the periods that I missed the commas. So focused on the closed doors that I missed the open windows, so focused on the silence that I missed the symphony. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this?" The voice said my name. "This is Sarah. I was your mother's nurse. I know this is strange, but I've been praying for you for 2 years. God kept putting you on my heart. Are you okay?" The room spun. "How did you get my number?" "I didn't. I dialed what I thought was my daughter's new number, but apparently I—" She paused. Oh my goodness, this is God, isn't it? I dialed wrong, but I dialed right. We talked for an hour. She told me about the nights she felt compelled to pray for the son of her patient, the son who was angry at God, the son who was wrestling with silence. She had written my name in her prayer journal dozens of times. She had asked God to show me what I couldn't see. "Can I tell you something?" she said before hanging up. "The night before your mother's surgery, I saw something. I know this sounds crazy, but I saw an angel in her room, just standing there, watching over her. And he looked familiar, like a janitor I had seen somewhere. He told me to tell you, when the time was right, that God's silence is never absence. It's just presence in a form we haven't learned to recognize yet." Michael, the janitor, the diner, the company, the angel, the dash. My mind couldn't process it all. The archaeology of my life was revealing that I had never been alone, not once, not ever. Every moment of silence had been filled with invisible activity. Every unanswered prayer had been answered in ways I couldn't have imagined. Every abandonment had been a secret rescue. I sat in my apartment that night, the same apartment where 48 hours ago I had been drowning in despair, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I worshipped, not the formal, structured kind, the messy, tear-filled, probably off-key kind. I sang songs I had forgotten I knew. I whispered thank you 1,000 times. I actually danced in my living room, probably looking absolutely insane, but not caring, because how else do you respond when you realize that the God you accused of absence had been carrying you the entire time? Isaiah 41:10 came back, but different now. Not as a mockery, but as a promise that had always been kept. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." He had been with me. In the silence, in the noise, in the collapse, in the rising. He had strengthened me through the very struggles I begged him to remove. He had helped me through people I didn't recognize as angels, through circumstances I had called coincidences, through a promotion disguised as a termination meeting. But here's the thing about divine archaeology. Once you start seeing God's fingerprints, you can't stop. Once you recognize the pattern, it becomes undeniable. The silence hadn't been empty. It had been pregnant with purpose I couldn't see, protection I didn't know I needed, and preparation for things I couldn't have handled without the wrestling. My phone buzzed, a text from the coworker I had left the note for. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. You saved my life. I'm 30 days clean today." Then another text from a number I didn't recognize. "You don't know me, but you gave my mom money for a motel 3 years ago when she was crying outside the shelter. She's housed now, has a job. She still talks about the angel who helped her that night. She wanted me to find you and say thank you." Then an email from my mother. "Honey, the strangest thing. I was going through old photos and found this. I don't remember taking it." The attachment was a photo of me in the hospital chapel the night before her surgery. I was on my knees, clearly praying, clearly broken. But behind me, slightly out of focus but definitely there, was a figure in what looked like a janitor's uniform, hand raised over me in what could only be described as a blessing. I'm going to tell you something now that you might not believe. But I swear it's true. As I sat there, phone in hand, evidence of miracles multiplying by the minute, I heard something. Not the divine whisper from before, not the internal voice of realization, but an actual, audible laugh, gentle, warm, like a father watching his child finally understand a joke that had been told years ago. And in that moment, I understood. The silence had never been silence at all. It had been God holding his breath, waiting for me to stop shouting long enough to notice he had been answering all along. Every prayer had been heard, every tear had been counted, every struggle had been witnessed, and every silence had been filled with more love than words could have carried. The divine archaeology was complete, or rather, it had just begun. Because now I could see it, the elaborate tapestry God had been weaving with the threads of my pain, my prayers, my silence, and my struggles. Each thread had looked like nothing on its own, but together they formed something beautiful, something purposeful, something that could only have been designed by a God who was never, ever absent. Tomorrow would come with new challenges, new silences to interpret, new prayers to pray. But I would face them differently now, because I knew the truth that changed everything. God's silence isn't absence. It's presence, taking a form we haven't learned to recognize yet. It's love, speaking in a language we're still learning to hear. It's grace so overwhelming that words would only diminish it. The archaeology had revealed the truth. I had been living in a miracle disguised as a life. And so, my dear friend, have you. But understanding this truth was only the beginning. Because once you see God's fingerprints in your past, you start recognizing His hand in your present. And that changes not just how you see your story, but how you live it. Which brings us to the final revelation, the sacred emergence, the moment when everything changes. The transformation is complete, but the mission has just begun. In Key Point 5, we discover what happens when someone who has excavated their pain becomes a voice for those still drowning in silence. Monday morning. Same desk, same computer, same coffee mug with the chip on the handle, but nothing was the same. I sat down at my workstation, the one where just days ago I had whispered desperate prayers into silence, and I saw it all differently. The fluorescent lights that had mocked me with their buzzing, they were just lights. The cursor that had blinked like an accusation, just a cursor. The office that had felt like a tomb, it was just a building full of humans carrying their own hidden stories, their own silent prayers, their own invisible wrestling matches with God. And that's when I saw her. New girl. First day. Standing by the printer looking exactly like I had looked 5 years ago. Lost, overwhelmed, trying to seem confident while drowning in imposter syndrome. She was doing that thing where you pretend to read papers while actually trying not to cry. I knew that move. I had perfected that move. Here's what the old me would have done. Nothing. Kept my head down, stayed in my lane, assumed someone else would help her. But the old me hadn't been through the archaeology. The old me hadn't discovered that every small act of kindness was God moving through human hands. The old me hadn't learned that we are the answer to each other's prayers. I walked over. First day? She nodded, eyes threatening to spill over. It's terrifying, isn't it? I said. Like everyone knows what they're doing except you. Like you're about to be exposed as a fraud. Like maybe God made a mistake when He opened this door. Her eyes widened. How did you? Because I've been you. Want to know a secret? I leaned in conspiratorially. Nobody here knows what they're doing. We're all just figuring it out as we go. But here's the better secret. You're exactly where you're supposed to be, even when it doesn't feel like it, especially when it doesn't feel like it. She laughed, a shaky sound, but real. I prayed for this job for months, and now that I have it, I'm terrified I'm going to fail. You might, I said, and her face fell. But failure here isn't what you think it is. Every mistake is data. Every struggle is strength training. Every moment you want to quit but don't, that's not just building your career, that's building your character. And between you and me, I pointed upward slightly, the big guy pays more attention to that second thing. That conversation was the beginning of understanding that my silence hadn't just been for me. It had been preparing me to be a voice for others sitting in their own silence. You see, wounded healers recognize wounds others try to hide. Those who've wrestled with God can spot another wrestler from across a room. Those who've done the archaeology of their own pain know exactly where to dig in someone else's story. Within a week, I had become the unofficial chaplain of the office. Not in any religious preachy way. God knows that would have sent everyone running. But in small ways. Leaving sticky notes of encouragement on desks when I noticed someone struggling. bringing coffee to the coworker going through a divorce, sitting with the manager having panic attacks in the bathroom, teaching her the breathing exercises that had kept me sane during my own dark nights. But here's where it gets profound. And stay with me, because this is about to flip your understanding of purpose completely. Every single struggle I had endured had prepared me for a specific person who needed exactly what I had learned. The loneliness in high school. It prepared me for Marcus in accounting, eating lunch alone every day, convinced he was invisible. I started joining him, just sitting there, not forcing conversation, but being present. 2 weeks later, he told me I was the first person in 3 years to eat lunch with him. 3 weeks later, he told me he'd been planning to end his life, but my presence had reminded him he wasn't as alone as he thought. The heartbreak at 22. It prepared me for Jennifer, whose engagement had just imploded publicly and messily. I could sit with her without offering platitudes, without trying to fix it, just holding space for her grief because I knew that sometimes the ministry of presence is more powerful than the ministry of answers. The terror of almost losing my job. It prepared me for Tom, who actually did lose his, who sat in his car in the parking lot crying because he didn't know how to face his family. I could tell him, with absolute authority born from experience, that God's provision doesn't always look like keeping the job. Sometimes it looks like losing everything so he can give you everything you actually need. But here's what nobody tells you about becoming a wounded healer. It's not a one-time transformation. It's a daily choice. Every morning I had to decide, would I let my scars be mere reminders of pain, or would I let them be maps for others to navigate their own darkness? 3 months into my promotion, something extraordinary happened. Remember that coworker who had been undermining me, the one who went to rehab? They came back. Different. Lighter. Alive in a way I had never seen them before. They walked straight to my desk, in front of everyone, and said, "I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my life. That note you left, I carry it in my wallet. Look." They pulled out a worn, sticky note, my handwriting faded but still readable. "Hey, you seem stressed. If you ever need to talk, I'm here." This was God speaking through you when he seemed silent to me, they continued. "You were the answer to a prayer I was too broken to pray, and I need you to know something." Their voice cracked. "Your kindness in the face of my cruelty showed me what God's love actually looks like. Unconditional, undeserved, unchanging." The office had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. We are all walking sermons. Every interaction is a potential divine encounter. Every kindness is a translation of God's love into a language someone can understand. 6 months passed. My mother stayed in remission. The promotion turned into a leadership role where I could actually implement changes to prevent others from drowning like I had. But more importantly, I had become something I never expected. A lighthouse for those lost in the storm of divine silence. They started coming to me. Not just co-workers, but friends of friends, strangers who had heard through the grapevine that I was someone who understood what it felt like when God seemed absent. They came with their journals full of unanswered prayers, their hearts full of accusation against a silent heaven, their faith hanging by threads so thin they were invisible. And to each one I could say, "I know. I've been there. Let me tell you what I learned in the silence." I started keeping a notebook of these encounters, and the pattern was stunning. Every person's silence was preparing them for something specific. The woman whose child was sick, her journey through medical uncertainty was preparing her to start a support group for other parents. The man whose business failed, his bankruptcy was positioning him to counsel entrepreneurs facing similar losses. The teenager who felt abandoned by God after her parents' divorce. She was becoming the youth leader who could reach kids hiding the same pain. But here's the revelation that still gives me chills. Remember Michael, the janitor? I finally found him. Not at work. He had never worked for our company. I found him at a homeless shelter downtown, serving soup. Same face, same eyes, same knowing smile. "You're not a janitor," I said. "I am," he replied. "Just not the kind you thought. I clean up messes, sometimes physical ones, sometimes spiritual ones, Sometimes I'm just there when someone needs to not be alone at 3 a.m. in a diner. Are you? I couldn't finish the question. I'm someone who learned what you're learning now, he said. That God's silence produces servants who can hear frequencies others miss, that our wounds become our ministry, that the prayers we think go unanswered are actually being answered through us for others. He served me soup, even though I was there to volunteer. You've graduated, he said, from asking, why is God silent, to becoming God's voice for others, asking the same question. The sacred emergence is complete. Now the real work begins. Now, let me tell you what the real work looks like. It looks like ordinary Tuesday afternoons when you notice someone staring at their computer screen with that 1,000-yard stare that means they're not really there. It looks like stopping, sitting down, and saying, "Want to talk about it?" It looks like keeping tissues in your desk drawer not for yourself, but for the moments when someone breaks down in your cubicle because you're the only person who doesn't try to fix them or quote Romans 8:28 at their pain. It looks like becoming fluent in the language of grief, the dialect of doubt, the vernacular of spiritual vertigo. It looks like being able to sit in someone else's silence without needing to fill it with words, because you remember how hollow words felt when you were drowning. But most importantly, and this is the part that will revolutionize how you see your own silence, it looks like being living proof that God's silence is not absence. You become the evidence someone else needs that they can survive this. You become the voice that says, I know it feels like he's abandoned you, but can I tell you what I discovered? Can I show you the archaeology of my own wounds? Can I help you dig for the treasures buried in your darkness? A year after my promotion, they asked me to speak at a company event, topic of my choice. I knew immediately what I would talk about. I stood in front of 500 employees and said, how many of you have ever felt like God was silent when you needed him most? Nearly every hand went up. Good, I said. Then you're qualified for the most important work you'll ever do. You're qualified to be someone else's evidence that silence doesn't mean absence. You're qualified to be a wounded healer. You're qualified to be the answer to prayers you don't even know are being prayed. I told them my story, all of it. The ugly parts, the desperate prayers, the accusation against God, the wrestling, the discovery, the archaeology, the emergence. And when I finished, the silence in that room wasn't empty. It was holy. It was hundreds of people recognizing their own story and mine, seeing their own archaeology waiting to be done, feeling their own emergence beginning. The emails started coming that afternoon. Story after story of divine silence that was actually divine preparation. People began doing their own archaeology, discovering their own patterns, recognizing the fingerprints they had missed. The office became different, not perfect, but more human, more honest, more aware that everyone was fighting battles invisible to the naked eye. But here's the most beautiful part, the silence between me and God. It had transformed completely. It was no longer the enemy. It had become a friend, because I had learned that God speaks volumes in the silence. You just have to learn the language. And that language isn't words, it's presence. It's the friend who shows up unexpectedly. It's the stranger who says exactly what you need to hear. It's the door that closes to protect you from something you couldn't see coming. It's the struggle that builds strength you didn't know you'd need. 2 years have passed since that night I stood on an empty street screaming at God. 2 years since I wrestled with heaven in a diner at 3 a.m. 2 years since I discovered that my abandonment was actually accompaniment I hadn't recognized. And now I can sit in my own silence without fear. Because I know that God is moving in it, through it, because of it. The silence isn't a gap in the conversation. It's God listening to my heartbeat, reading thoughts I haven't formed into words, preparing answers to questions I haven't learned to ask yet. Last week, the new girl, not so new anymore, came to my office. I need to tell you something, she said. That first day when you talked to me, I had pills in my purse. I was going to go home and take them all. But you said something that stopped me. What did I say? You said I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That even when it didn't feel like it, especially when it didn't feel like it. And for some reason, I believed you. And now, a year later, I can see it. Every hard day was building something. Every moment I wanted to quit but didn't was creating who I'm becoming. She paused, then added, "I've started leaving sticky notes for the newer people. Just little encouragements. Is that okay? Is that okay?" I wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously. The sacred emergence wasn't just mine. It was multiplying. Each wounded healer was creating more wounded healers. Each person who had wrestled with divine silence was becoming a voice for others in their wrestling. This is what I know now, what I want you to know if you're sitting in your own silence, wondering why God won't speak. The silence is not rejection, it's incubation. Something is being formed in you that couldn't be formed any other way. The silence is not absence, it's presence so profound that words would diminish it. The silence is not punishment, it's preparation for a purpose you can't yet imagine. You are becoming a wounded healer. Your scars are becoming someone else's map to survival. Your unanswered prayers are becoming answers to prayers you don't know are being prayed. Your wrestling with God is building strength someone else will need to borrow. And one day, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, you'll look back at your own archaeology and see it. The perfect pattern, the divine fingerprints, the evidence that you were never, ever alone. You'll see that every silence was full of sacred activity, every absence was actually presence in disguise, every unanswered prayer was being answered in ways that required the silence to accomplish. But more than that, you'll become the voice someone else needs to hear when heaven seems silent to them. You'll be the hands that leave sticky notes of hope. You'll be the presence that sits with someone in their darkness without trying to fix it. You'll be the wounded healer who can say with absolute authority, "I know it hurts. I know it feels like abandonment. But let me tell you what I discovered in my own silence. Let me show you what God might be doing that you can't see yet." And in that moment, you'll understand the final truth. We are God's voice to each other. We are the answer to prayers we don't know are being prayed. We are the evidence of divine presence in what feels like divine absence. The silence of God isn't really silence at all. It's the pause before the symphony. It's the inhale before the word that changes everything. It's the space where miracles are prepared, where wounded healers are forged, where ordinary people become extraordinary evidence of a God who was never, not for 1 second, absent. So here's my benediction for you, sitting in your own silence, fighting your own battles, wrestling with your own doubts. May you find in your archaeology evidence of presence where you only saw absence. May you discover that your wounds are not just wounds, but wells of healing for others. May your silence become sacred, your wrestling become worship, your emergence become someone else's evidence that they can survive. May you learn to hear God in frequencies beyond words, in the kindness of strangers, in the closing of wrong doors, in the struggles that sculpt your soul. May you become fluent in the language of divine silence, recognizing it not as abandonment, but as accompaniment in its most profound form. And may you emerge from your silence not bitter, but better, not broken, but beautiful, not abandoned, but appointed as a wounded healer in a world full of wounds that need exactly what your healing has taught you. The silence is not empty. It never was. It's full of God, full of purpose, full of preparation for the moment when you'll be the voice someone else needs to hear say, "You're not alone. You never were." Let me tell you what I learned in my silence. Let me show you the God who speaks most clearly when words would only get in the way. Why is God silent? Now you know. He's not. He's just been speaking in a language that takes a broken heart to understand, a wrestled faith to recognize, and a wounded healer to translate for others still learning to hear. Your silence is not your curse, it's your calling. Your wounds are not your weakness, they're your ministry. Your unanswered prayers are not rejections, they're redirections toward becoming the answer to someone else's prayer. The sacred emergence is complete. But really, it's just beginning. Because now you know the secret. In the economy of heaven, nothing is wasted. Not your pain, not your prayers, not even your silence. Especially not your silence. Welcome to the fellowship of wounded healers. Welcome to the ministry of sacred silence. Welcome to discovering that God was never silent. We just hadn't learned yet what his voice really sounds like. It sounds like you, Telling your story to someone who needs to know they'll survive theirs.